The House Oversight Committee is now questioning another one of President Biden's former aides, the ninth one so far, and there are more on the list. Wait till you see. Bruce Reed was Biden's former deputy chief of staff for policy and a key player in what's being called Biden's Politburo. And the close inner circle, which held remarkable influence in the previous administration. Aisha Hasni is on Capitol Hill. Aisha.
Hey, there were other than Hunter and Jill Biden. This is the last remaining member of that Politburo the Oversight Committee is trying to get answers from. He's been in there now for over 2 hours, so he is talking enough that they are keeping him in there and continuing their questioning. We'll see once this wraps up. It could be several hours. Some of these have gone up until for about 5 hours, some of these depositions. He didn't want to answer any questions, though, when he walked into this deposition. Take a listen here. Hi, Mr. Reed. Did you think that the president was competent to serve as the leader of this country? Did you feel like there was at any moment that you doubted that? Did he become more forgetful over time? Mr. Reed, what happened after that debate? Mr. Reed, who was in charge? Should voters trust Democrats again? And Harris, you're right. Reed was part of this tight group of about 5 people that the book Original Sin talks about, the decision makers, the inner circle of the White House that were extremely close to the former president. And according to that book, the group also included Mike Donnellan, Steve Ricchetti, Ron Klain, and family members Jill Biden and Hunter Biden. Now, all of these folks, except for the 2 Biden family members, have already come over here and basically told the committee that they were defending the president. They believe that he was competent and fit to serve, although Ron Klain told the committee, apparently, according to a source, that he had become more and more forgetful over time. Up next, we expect to see Anita Dunn on Thursday, and then White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. That'll be a big one that happens next week. Harris.
All right, Aisha, thank you very much. You had quite a reaction there.
Involuntary. Oh, gosh, KJP, she's coming back. She's coming back. What will she say? Yeah, so I just think I'm expecting more of the same with this. They all defend him. You know, he was dubbed the ultimate decision maker. So I would like them to ask him about the Autopen, because Joe Biden told the New York Times that when he would pardon people, he would just tell his staffers what his standards were for pardoning. So as the president of the United States, you're the only one that can pardon. You shouldn't have to say, this is my standard, and y'all can make the decisions for me, and y'all can slap the Autopen on the form that lets someone out of prison or pardons them from crimes. It shouldn't be worked that way or used that way. So does that really mean that some of these pardons aren't really pardons? What's the validity of these pardons? How involved was Joe Biden? So I hope he's asked about the Autopens, and the weaponization of government, and the Russia collusion hoax would be wonderful too. But they're also just talking about the cover-up. What did he know? How much was covered up? These are questions we all have.
Well, the one thing with Bruce Reed today, Joey, is that he's one of 2 people that has voluntarily gone before the committee. And the rest have either pled the fifth or said they don't remember. I mean, which they can do. He can't plead the fifth here, though.
I think this is a situation where you either have to catch 2 people saying completely contradictory statements and then follow that lead, or you have to find emails, something in writing. You have to find some evidence where they're saying one thing in these hearings and have said in a matter-of-fact way the opposite somewhere else. Because otherwise, it's almost a matter of opinion, right? Like, do you think, do you feel, do you believe he was competent in his ability to make decisions? And it's easy enough to say, yeah, I think he was in a good spot. And then unless you can go find an email or a phone recording or something that kind of shows that you're lying, and then it becomes a bigger issue. Usually when law enforcement investigators do something like this, they're trying to put pressure to get these individual folks to turn on each other, you know, alluding to someone said something else, and who's going to kind of rat out the rest of them first. I don't know that Congress really has that type of pressure. I think a lot of this is, probably for naught. I'm not saying it's not worthy, but I don't know the outcome is going to be what people want it to be. And there are a whole lot of things from, you know, a guy with an island to this, that people wanted a different outcome or a stronger outcome or a more obvious outcome. And I think with this, the biggest outcome for our country is we're now a part of a conversation of what is competency for a president. You talk about the Autopen. I think it's Andy McCarthy said that the Constitution doesn't mandate that a pardon be signed. And President Trump used that exact same argument when saying, I deemed that declassified. So maybe that becomes a bigger discussion as to how does the president's power transfer.
Well, and the reason that I think it's important what you're looking at, Ainsley, and so say maybe a pardon doesn't need that Autopen or
I'm not saying it made it a right thing.
What does matter is the delegation of power.
Yeah.
And his understanding and passed on to somebody else who would get,
are you
because maybe it went beyond signing a piece of paper.
Yeah.
We don't know. If he was not competent to serve this nation, where else did he not just delegate power, but not even be aware of what he was giving away the power for? So I think that's a fair question.
The end result is transparency more than consequence.
The bigger issue is not if Biden was cognitively fit to be president, but it's how much influence is happening behind closed doors of unelected officials, and how much influence do they have on our democracy, because that is the ultimate threat to democracy. We are supposed to have elected officials making our laws, leading us. And as Ainsley's pointing out, if you have a president who's just saying, these are my standards for pardoning, and not giving individual pardons, does this negate the validity of the pardons in general? I think this is going to be a much broader conversation, and not some of this is political theater, what we're seeing right now, but we need to do a deep dive into what are our standards when it comes to use of the Autopen. I love electronic signatures. They make my life very easy these days. So I say the president can use one, but it's not just about using an electronic signature. It's making sure that he is the one who is signing these laws, the executive orders, making sure that the pardons are coming from him as well. That's the bigger conversation to be having.
And Emily, meanwhile, we see the president signing another executive order at 4 p.m. Eastern today. We've seen him sign a lot of things.
Yeah, comparable only to FDR in history. Going back to what you said, I agree. And I think where we will see the most documentation that can actually lead potentially to accountability is either from the physician and in the form of medical records. So what diagnoses were not revealed or what tests were not conducted, and then in the form of the Autopen, because from what we know thus far, there was a lot of oral transmission of orders from the commander-in-chief that were then conveyed a second time orally to interns and aides, who then emailed it, and then that was somehow conceived as delegation of the commander-in-chief executive power. So there's a million questions, rightly so, about the efficacy of that delegation and about the honor afforded that particular constitutionally mandated executive authority that was clearly totally thwarted and clearly totally butchered in the form of thousands of pardons per day of really horrifying individuals that met a standard the president himself claimed to create. But I have no doubt, simply as an American citizen, he did not have the wherewithal to articulate that. And especially when you contrast that with Hunter's pardon, where he did make sure he signed his son's favor personally.
Well, and to that point, not that they would ever try to call him, I would likely think, because he couldn't remember anything for the Robert Hur report, and that was 2 years ago, so I don't know really what he would remember now.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.